Hi everyone, my name is Colby Brown. I'm a Sony ambassador and I'm here with B&H in Ecuador filming this new video series with this week's episode focused on landscape photography. Now we're covering a lot of things in this week's episode, including time-lapse photography. We're talking about panoramas, we're shooting some sunrise and sunsets, and we're also dealing with the weather as we're out here near Cotopaxi, the Cotopaxi National Park here in this beautiful country. Now we got a lot of things that we're going to cover, so we're going to go ahead and jump right in. Hope you guys stick around and enjoy the video. This morning we were out here for sunrise in the Avenue of the Volcanoes here in Ecuador, with a focus on Cotopaxi behind me. And that's kind of our main focus while we're out here in this particular region. Now I have a handful of different ideas of things I would like to photograph, including panoramas, maybe even show you guys how to shoot a time lapse. But for right now, I'm actually looking for just kind of a standard straight shot. Now what we have is we have the sun rising over here to my right, your left, and hopefully as it rises over the mountains and over the clouds, it's going to hit some of the volcano behind us. Now Cotopaxi, if it reveals itself, is one of the most perfectly shaped cone volcanoes in the world, which is why I love coming to this particular region. Right now I'm set up with my tripod on my Sony A1 with a 24-105 f4 lens. As I mentioned in the gear video, this is a great lens for landscape work. I'm shooting at f11. Right now I have an ISO of 100 because again, we're shooting from a tripod. You want to have those really clean ISOs, clean colors, clean details, and I don't mind dragging my shutter a little bit. And our shutter speed right now is about 0.6 seconds, and I'll adjust that as light continues to hopefully flow into the scene and we get something a little bit more dynamic. Now these particular regions, when you're up here in the high mountains, can be challenging for that really beautiful early morning light, like the pre-dawn stuff, because it is the area surrounded by mountains. So oftentimes that type of light can get blocked from the sun tipping towards the horizon and then that light hitting the clouds above it. It's still possible, but it's a little bit more difficult, especially as you inch closer to sunrise. So what we're hoping is that after sun rises, which right now is around 6:16 a.m., is that some of that light will then permeate and hit our subject, giving us something to work with. If we don't get that, then what we can play around with is a little bit more of a dynamic or moody kind of image where we'll have to play around with it in post-processing using things like Photoshop and curves and other things I can show you guys if it turns out. If it doesn't turn out, we're gonna go a different route and see what we get. So something that we talked about in the first video series I filmed with B&H back in Dingman Falls in Pennsylvania last year was the fact that you don't want to be an anchor. You don't want to find yourself sitting in either one location or just using a single composition. So in this particular setup, I'm constantly zooming in and out between 105 to 24 to figure out what is the best composition to make the focus on my subject, which is Cotopaxi and the light around it. So I'm having some fun playing around with creating some more complicated compositions by zooming back out and getting all this kind of crazy complicated foreground, as well as zooming in and isolating out to make sure that Cotopaxi becomes, becomes the main focus of what we're trying to do here. And that way at the end of this shoot, I have 5, maybe even 10 different options for me to process to figure out which one's going to be the best one that tells the story that I'm trying to take here. So one of the reasons that I particularly chose the 24-105 is because I wanted to give the clouds a bit more room in order to grab some of that color. I could have zoomed in more, used a 70-200 or one of the other lenses we brought on this trip, but this 24-105 gave me a good balance. And hopefully, as you guys can see here in the background, the light around the Cotopaxi volcano is actually lighting up. The clouds are starting to look quite beautiful. So it's giving us a bit more color than I was actually expecting. So this is a nice surprise. We're gonna grab some of these kind of standard straight up horizontal shots. And then as the light changes, I might switch lenses and try something different. But for now, this is exactly the shot I was going for. So what's happening right now is the light's drastically changing. Just as I expected, as the light was peeking over the horizon, it's actually starting to hit Cotopaxi itself. I was worried it might actually hit one of the mountains on the left-hand side, of the Cotopaxi this time of year, but I was actually wrong, which was, again, a great surprise. So I've changed for the 24 to 105, where I'm going to get more of the sky and hopefully the colors that we had about 10-15 minutes ago. And now I've changed to my 200 to 600, so I could really zoom in and isolate some of those spectrums of light just as they hit the Cotopaxi volcano. We might not get to see the peak because it's very hard. It's often in clouds this time of year, but we can get some really dynamic light that would be really fun to process. Some of the dirt just below the snow line is actually lighting up. It almost feels like a reddish or an orange, and we can bring that out in post-processing. This provides some really great compositional opportunities to create some almost like abstract landscape images in a situation that I wasn't necessarily planning on it, but it's presented itself, so I'm changing my approach. If you're not sure what to do or if the light is changing, zoom in and isolate, and you might be surprised with what you get. Oh, that light's so beautiful. When you're working on grass like we are right now here just outside of our hotel here in Cotopaxi, you have to keep into account just the thickness and the cushion of the grass, because grass has a little bit of give. So when you set up your tripod, make sure obviously that it's sturdy, make sure your legs are expanded out, make sure that you're good on all those fronts. But you also should set up a 2-second or 5-second delay, or use a wireless remote. The reason for that is that when you press the shutter button down, you can give some vibrations throughout your tripod and your camera, and that can be felt throughout the grass. And so you have this kind of give where it kind of might sink down just a centimeter or even a millimeter, and that could be enough to throw off your image potentially if you were just shooting regularly. So that's a friendly piece of advice. Use a wireless or a wired remote, or just use a 2 or 5-second delay when working on soft ground like this. So when you have a scene like this where light's changing, or you're taking images and you're like, oh, this would be really great if I had a 200 or a 300 megapixel version of this because the light is so dynamic, it's a great opportunity to use a panorama. So what you need to do is essentially, you have a couple different pieces that you need. Because this subject is so far away, you first off need a telephoto lens so you could zoom in enough in order to create this panorama. Zooming in enough allows us to fill enough of the subject with each of the frames so that we get the shot that we're after. From there, you want to be able to rotate and to be able to shoot in vertical orientation, even if we're creating a horizontal image. The reason for that is that it creates a more pleasing style for when you actually stitch the images together. You don't have to deal with so much with parallax, which is essentially a changing of the origin point of the image actually being created. This is also taken into account by the fact that we can shoot in vertical orientation directly over our tripod. This helps with finding that sweet spot for your tripod itself, so that you don't have to deal with too much of that parallax. On top of that, using a ball head that allows you to make small articulations left to right or right to left to get each of those shots will really help. So let's go ahead and show you guys how to do that in real time, looking at some detail shots of my setup here. We're here taking a normal horizontal landscape shot. So what we're going to do first is we're going to change over into the vertical orientation. So on a telephoto lens, you have this button that just allows you to loosen it and then move into the vertical orientation. As you can see, we're still centered over our tripod, which again is key. If you have the ability to shoot at a perfect horizon level, that's what you want. You have a little horizon option setting within your camera on the LCD screen to tell you when you're perfectly level. If you have that ability and it's perfectly level for the scene you're trying to take, that's great. That makes it easier for you. That means you're going to lose less megapixels when you stitch those images together. But if you don't, you can make it slightly off and just try to follow the same track all the way across. So the key is to figure out where you want to start on the left or the right, and then work through it first if you have time, if light's not fading, and go left to right or right to left, and kind of just work through it almost like you're faking it, so that you know exactly where you want to start and stop. The key with panoramas is to give yourself a little bit more room than you think you need, because you're always going to crop in some of that during the post-processing phase. And then what you essentially do is you're taking these vertical images of this horizontal scene, and then you're overlapping them. Usually I recommend by at least 30%. So 30% overlap with every single shot. As you guys are going, here's one shot, here's the next shot, here's the next shot, here's the next shot. And keep going on like that, and that's going to give you some great opportunities to stitch those together. So let's go ahead and do this and show how this works in practice. So we found our left side. I'm going to grab the shot. The horizon's not perfect, but that's okay. So we got the shot there. I'm going to move slightly, still got some overlap. Lined it up as best I could. I'm gonna keep moving on for our third shot. I'm about in the middle of the Cotopaxi volcano right now, which is good. It's gonna give us a lot of stuff to play with. The light's really hitting Cotopaxi beautifully right now. And then to the far right. And so as I mentioned, on each of the left and the right, I gave extra room on those corners of the frame I actually want to create. Because again, that extra room you're gonna have to be able to play with when it comes to stitching these together in both Lightroom or Photoshop, or if you have another post-processing software that you prefer to use. Either way, most of the process is the same, and we can show you how to stitch these together during the editing video, which is coming up at the end of this video series. There's gonna be a lot of great stuff in the coming weeks, but for now, I hope you guys are excited about this as I am, because this scene just got a lot more dynamic. And as I mentioned before, I wasn't expecting this morning. So after sunrise, we decided to jump in the car and drive a bit closer to the edge of Cotopaxi National Park to get a bit closer to the volcano to create a time lapse. This is a great opportunity because the wind is blowing a little bit here. You guys might actually hear it in the audio, but it's moving the clouds so fast that it's really great for time lapse opportunities. So I'm gonna check a couple different compositions and try to figure out what's gonna be the best starting point, and then we'll talk through different settings and what that means. Now, when it comes to compositions, I do want you guys to take into account that your standard image ratio is 2:3. And the reason that's important is that if you're creating a time-lapse video, most of your videos are gonna be a 16:9 ratio. So just realize that you're gonna clip a little bit of the bottom and the top part of the bars. So you need to account for that when it comes to composing for a time lapse, especially if you're doing it in camera. So essentially what we're doing is we're creating all the images, and then post-processing, we're gonna put them together. And I'll show you guys how to do that as well. But this is the best way to go about it, because if you do find yourself in a situation where the light just goes crazy or something happens and you just get an incredible experience, you also have all the raw image files to work with, as well as the ability to create a time lapse, and that gives you more opportunity down the line. So now let's talk a little bit about camera settings. I'm not talking about time-lapse settings, we're gonna get to that in just a second. The camera settings. The most important element of the exposure triangle, your ISO, your shutter speed, and your aperture, when it comes to time-lapse is gonna be your shutter speed. Now again, in an ideal, in a perfect world, you wanna have a pretty slow shutter speed to kind of drag the frame a bit, which is somewhere around 1/40th of a second. That's kind of my happiest place when I'm working with fast-moving subjects, because if you think about creating a 24 frames per second time-lapse video, which we'll talk about in a second, it is important to have that kind of cinematic motion-like feel that you get from film video rather compared to internet video. And so in a perfect world, as I mentioned, I'd shoot in at 1/40th, I'd have neutral density filters. I just don't have those here. So for now, I'm using ISO 100, I'm shooting at f10, aperture doesn't really matter in this situation, and then I'm shooting at a high shutter speed, around 1/800th of a second. I still think we're gonna get some great stuff, but like I said, in an ideal situation, I'd probably wanna have a lower shutter speed in order to get the exact type of time lapse that I wanted in this situation. So now that we're talking about actual settings for creating your time lapse, let's talk about setting that up inside your Sony mirrorless camera. So once you hit the menu button, you're gonna go ahead and start off with the shooting menu. Now this is again with the Sony A1, so it might be slightly different for yours, but regardless, you wanna find your way down to the drive mode and then go down to interval shoot function. Now interval shoot function again might be different in your particular Sony mirrorless body, but in the A1, this is where it's at. Now from here, we have a handful of different settings that we need to talk a bit through, so bear with me for just a minute as we walk through each of these step by step. Now interval shooting, the first option you want to set to on. This essentially means that you're gonna want to shoot interval time-lapse photos, so needs to be on, it's gonna be off by default. Your shooting start time, this is essentially how long do you want it to start from the moment that you press the buttons. You have 1 second, you have a 1 second delay as we set right here, but you can change it to whatever you want to. For this situation, starting with 1 second is perfectly fine. Now, super important here is the shooting interval. This is essentially the interval between each of your different images. So I have mine set to 3 seconds. Sometimes you want 1 second. Sometimes you can go up to 5 seconds or even longer if you're shooting, say, a time lapse of, say, the Milky Way and the night sky above you. But for these types of situations where we have fast moving clouds, you want to adjust the shooting interval to counter for it. So for me, usually 3 seconds is a good starting point, and it's the place that I find myself most happy with in terms of the results. If you find yourself in a situation with slow moving clouds, definitely move it up to say 5 or maybe even 6 or 7 seconds, depending on how far away the clouds are from the camera itself as you begin shooting. So the next option we have here is number of shots. Now, number of shots is important because this helps determine how many images are going to be captured in the time lapse you're trying to create. The side note here is that you need to figure out if you want to create a 24 frames per second time lapse or a 30 frames per second time lapse. A 24 frames per second time lapse works great with other 24 frames per second footage. So if you want that cinematic, that movie or film-like feeling, you want to stick with 24 frames per second. Whereas if you're going more for, say, internet or YouTube or viral video, things like that, oftentimes it's more 30 seconds or above. But regardless, this is where you have to do a little bit of math, because if I decide to create a 24 frames per second time lapse, I need to figure out the duration or how long I want my time lapse to actually run for. So if I want a 10-second time lapse and I'm shooting for 24 frames per second video, I need to do 24 times 10, which equals 240. So we can go ahead and change this down to 240. And what's going to happen is at the bottom of the frame, you guys can see there it says shooting interval 3 seconds, which we already set before, and it's going to say shooting time. So this is going to tell you how long an actual physical time it's going to take to create this time lapse. Now from there we have AE tracking sensitivity. This is important if you find yourself not shooting in manual mode. There'll be times where you want to shoot transition periods, say from day to night or morning to day, things like that for sunrise, sunset, astro. For today's purposes, we're going to go ahead and leave this on mid because it doesn't matter because we are shooting in manual mode regardless. If you continue heading down on the menu settings, you now have shutter type interval, which is electronic shutter, which we're leaving it on. So once you have all these settings dialed in, you can go ahead and hit the rear center button on the rear wheel on your camera to lock all those settings in. And then assuming you have your composition and your actual camera settings set, you can go ahead and press the shutter button and the interval shots will begin shooting. Now remember, this is not going to actually create the video for you. What it's going to do is going to create the actual photo files that you can then use to create a time lapse in post-processing. Just make sure you're shooting in RAW and you're not shooting in JPEG because you'll have more flexibility to kind of process or at least lightly edit some of those images before you actually put them into a time-lapse video that you can use for other purposes. Well, that's a wrap on this week's landscape episode. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. We got incredibly lucky with the weather. Things just socked in here with Cotopaxi, but we've had some great opportunities for sunrise, panoramas, time lapses, all sorts of great stuff. Now in next week's episode, we're leaving the comforts of the cold climates I'm used to head to the Amazonian jungle for humidity, for bugs, for wildlife, and all sorts of great stuff out there. I hope you guys stick around for next week's episode. It's going to be epic.